Demon Kissed, Chapter 19. "No," I said, and leapt to the top of a tall building on my left. "You're moving pretty quickly," she commented, adding, "How long before you get here?" Jumping the gap between two more buildings and crossing the rooftop in nanoseconds, I paused before making the next jump to do a bit of estimating. "Another 2 minutes or so, I believe," I said, then asked, "Why?" and made the slightly vertical leap to the next rooftop. I sensed something powerfully dark on the street below after landing, and stopped moving abruptly. Falling into a defensive crouch, I sent my senses out to scan the surrounding area, and crept to the edge of the roof to look down at the street 7 stories below. Narrowing my eyes, I used every sense I had to try and find the dark power I had sensed so briefly a second ago. But whatever it had been was either gone or was hiding its presence from me entirely now. Uneasy about losing the sense of the being, I pulled the dark red pendant I wore out of my shirt and tapped it twice quickly, then shifted forms. My vision blurred. I felt and heard my bones and joints breaking, only to reform as I bent forward in my crouch and placed my hands on the roof I was on. My clothing vanished as fur flowed over my skin, and my senses became far more acute than they were in my human form. When it was over, I sat with my head down for a moment, slightly disoriented, and just let myself adjust to the sensory changes. It had been a very long time since I last changed into my beast shape, and as I sat there, I began to have difficulty controlling the cat within my soul. The jaguar whose form I had changed into was pushing at me, and I was pushing back as hard as I could so that my body remained still. I suddenly realized that it wasn't just how long it had been since I took this form that was making it hard to maintain my control. My inner cat was eager to finish my journey to Alistair's. As the cat and I were the same being, this made sense to me. What did not make sense was the lack of caution and discord I could sense undermining my control of my other half. I had lived with the jaguar in my soul for centuries, and I could only recall one other time that the cat had tried to take full control. What had caused it that time was a slight change in Lay's scent after she returned from a job, and her new scent had nearly driven me crazy. I had never understood the why behind it, and had, quite frankly, almost forgotten it entirely. But this time it was more like an outside force, rather than an internal one, that was causing it, and I tried to figure out where it was coming from. After a moment of debate, I turned physical control over to the cat and focused solely on finding the source of the discord between my inner cat and my human sides. I was only 20 blocks or so from my destination, and the cat settled after I began moving again, seemingly content to stroll over the rooftops at an easy lope. By the time Alistair's white brick mansion came into view, I was thoroughly frustrated and so uneasy on a deep level that I briefly considered lurking outside for an hour or two to continue trying to figure it out. "You came all the way here across Outer City from North Side Donovan Street. Why stay outside where it's cold? Even if you do figure it out, what can you do about it right now? Come meet me, Dominic. Figure it out later. I'll be sitting in the window seat in my room when you get here," Erin said in my mind, her mental voice a bit shaky. "Have you never witnessed a shift before?" I asked curiously, leaping lightly to the ground and wending my way through the deepening shadows along the street to Alistair's driveway gate. "We can talk about what I have and have not seen when you come to my room," she said, and withdrew from my mind. I hadn't sensed any kind of emotion at all from her before she left, and I wondered if that was a good omen or not. I had been getting small emotional flashes from her until she spoke to me just now. Intrigued, I leapt over the gate and loped up the drive. I reversed the shift as I went up to the porch, and was human in form once again when Lucian opened the door.
"You're here early,"
"The sun is still barely up," he said, and waved me inside. "I've been around longer than you have, Bat Boy, so you can bite me," I said, stepping into the house and baring my fangs in a smile. He flipped me off, a similarly, if a bit more sinister smile on his face, and began walking toward the stairs. "Whatever you say, Puss in Boots, whatever you say," he said over his shoulder mockingly, and I just shook my head. The more things change, I thought, and followed him. "Why will you not call me Batman, at least?" he asked in a slightly whining tone. "Because I would have to call you Man-Bat instead, and that would be wrong beyond measure," I told him gravely, as he stopped in front of the first door we came to on the right and knocked. "Come in," was called from inside the room, and Lucian opened the door, then stepped aside quickly. Giving him a quizzical glance, I stepped past him into the room and glanced around curiously. The room was boring. The paint on the walls was boring. The one painting on one wall by the window was a boring landscape. The carpet looked new and could not have been a more boring beige if it tried. The door closed behind me, and I turned to look at it, noting that Lucian had not entered the room with me. The color of green that the door was painted stopped me for a moment, and I just stared at it in horror. That shade of green should have been outlawed centuries ago. What had my old friend been thinking to put that horrifying color on the bedroom door, if he had planned ahead of time to put Aaron in here? I thought dazedly, and felt the artistic side of my nature throw up somewhere deep inside my soul. I suddenly remembered that he had told me last night, as we were talking, that the room would be hers to change if she liked, if she decided to stay, and the only thing I could think of was that it was intended to drive her to stay, but I had a feeling it would do the opposite. "Horrible, isn't it?" a female voice said behind me, and I recognized it as belonging to Aaron. Shuddering slightly in horror, I turned away from the atrocious door and looked at her. "That is one word for it, my lady," I said, nodding, and asked, "Have you mentioned your opinion of the room to Alistair?" "No, I haven't seen him for a while," Aaron said, then added, "My name is Aaron Malone. Mr. Dominic Goodfellow, first-line descendant of the Blackthorn bloodline, at your service," I said, sweeping off my hat and giving her a slight courtly bow. "You look more like a dangerously hot bad boy than a good fellow to me, and a good-looking one at that, Mr. Goodfellow," she said, then giggled and added under her breath, "I am so high right now. I really need to quit taking the painkillers that Isaac keeps giving me. They make me frickin' loopy." Raising my eyebrows at her words, I set my hat on the bedside table and walked over to her. She straightened slightly on the window seat, watching how I moved as I walked toward her, and I saw the word "damn" form on her lips. I also heard her heart rate speed up, and noted she was tracking the movements and height of my body intently as I walked. "Interesting, very interesting," I thought musingly. "It will be very entertaining to see if she tracks the movements of every other kin being she comes into contact with like that, or if it is only shadowkin she tracks so intently. Though I do wonder if it might just be me she's tracking like that, and if so, why?" Just one more question in a long line of them where she was concerned. "How did you end up in Alistair's care, my lady?" I asked, stopping in front of her and looking her over. Glancing down, I noted that she wore a nearly see-through white t-shirt and that a red blanket covered her legs. I noted a faint lump in her lap, and recalling what Cade had said yesterday, I assumed that she was armed. It didn't bother me, but I did wonder why she would feel the need to be armed in a place where she should feel safe. Returning my gaze to her face, I noted several barely visible scratches and bruises on her chin, cheeks, and collarbone. My gaze tracked back down to her arms, and I took note of more scratches and bruises there as well. Alistair had told me some of the story last night, but I wanted to hear her talk about him and see if I could pick up her feelings about him. He had seemed to become very withdrawn and agitated last night every time the conversation had turned to Aaron. Not like himself at all, when I compared it with how he had sounded when speaking to me of her not a week ago, and I wanted to know why. We were in a fight with a walker. I was hurt, and he brought me here, she said, and I nodded slightly. It matched a little with what little Alistair had said last night. Erin Malone was a beautiful woman under the faint bruises and scratches, I noted. Small and curvy, with fine-boned, delicate features, Erin had dark emerald green eyes with dark blue around the pupils, and that were tilted a bit like a cat's at the outer corners, and full bow-shaped lips. I reached out to gently trace one of the scratches on her cheek, and she froze at my touch. I pulled my hand back and placed it under her chin to examine a darker bruise on her forehead that was nearly hidden by her hair. "What were your injuries?" I asked, and noted that her heart rate had jumped again at my touch. "I have a few cracked ribs and a couple of stitched-up lacerations. The stitches hurt a bit sometimes, and I take painkillers for the pain of the ribs. Oh, and major blood loss," she said, and shrugged her right shoulder. The bruise was not as bad as I had first thought, and I released her chin after another moment. I then examined her neck for visible injuries. Nothing. No bandages, cuts, and no punctures, and her wrists, though a little bruised, were free of injury. "What caused your injuries?" I asked, taking in other details about her looks and visible injuries, foregoing for the moment my inclination to examine her legs for signs of major injuries. Long, midnight black hair that I noted had dark red roots, fell in loose waves around her heart-shaped face, and lay over her chest and small waist to pool in her lap. Her smooth-looking skin had a slight golden tint to it, and there was a small smattering of freckles on the bridge of her slightly up-tilted nose. "A non-fight with Alistair and some shrapnel from an exploding walker," she said, and I blinked. Alistair had mentioned the walker last night, but not that it had blown up. "Why did the walker explode?" I asked, ignoring the non-fight with Alistair part for the moment. "Alistair used one of my grenades on it," she said, and I returned my gaze to her face. "He used a grenade to kill a walker?" I asked distractedly as I studied her face. Dark, sooty lashes shaded her eyes, and there was a small, faint scar on her left cheek below her eye. "After I shot a hole in it, but yeah, he used a grenade to kill it," she said, and sighed. She also had a faint rose-vine-shaped birthmark on her throat, I noted when she swallowed and drew my attention there once more. I studied it for a second, then returned to my study of her face. "Why are you looking at my face so hard? Do I have something on it?" she asked after a moment, and wiped her hands over her mouth and chin. "No, you have nothing on your face. You are quite beautiful, though," I said seriously, still studying her face carefully, and she looked down at her hands, blushing. "May I?" I asked, indicating the open space on the window seat next to her, and she nodded. Sitting next to her, one leg folded under me with my back leaning against the window frame, I continued to look at her, and made a sketch of her in my mind to recreate in a painting later. I, thank you?" she said, and it sounded more like a question than a statement. "You are welcome," I said, cocking my head to one side and regarding her for a moment before adding, I am pleased to finally meet you in person. Alistair has spoken much of you. I, um, I'm pleased to meet you too, she said after clearing her throat and turned her head to look at me. I saw the question in her eyes about my phrasing, and I indicated the closed door, then sent her an image of Lucian standing outside through our mind link. She nodded. The pleasure is mine, I assure you. You seem flustered this evening, my lady. Might I inquire as to why? I said, meeting her gaze and holding it for a long moment. I've had guys call me pretty or even fair, but no one has ever called me beautiful before, and I'm a bit unsure as to how to deal with it, she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear and glancing away toward her lap. Even my friend Alistair has been remiss in mentioning this to you? I asked incredulously. I haven't been precisely nice to him on any of the occasions that he has spoken to me, she said, and bit her bottom lip for a moment, then continued. And when we last spoke 2 days ago, I think I may have said or done something that upset him. I found this a little hard to believe. The Frenchman had been tragically pathetic, emotionally, whenever he had spoken to me of her until last night, and had been pursuing her relentlessly for years as a romantic partner. If you would, please explain, I said, and her gaze shot to mine. Smiling faintly, I clarified. Tell me exactly what happened when you last spoke with him, please. And she looked away again. I watched her face and waited patiently for her to speak. When she finally began to speak, long minutes later, her voice was devoid of emotion, and distant, as though reciting facts about a conversation between total strangers that had nothing to do with her. With some prodding and a few pointed questions, I got the whole story out of her and just looked at her for several minutes, thinking. I was missing some small piece of information here, because the pieces I had were not coming together at all, and I fully intended to find out the answers to this particular puzzle. But there would be time for that later. I decided to let it go for now, and said, After you are healed, I would like to train with you and teach you our laws. Alistair mentioned last night that he needed your help with something, and if you agree to assist him, you will need to know what I will teach you. Even if you do not agree to help, you will still need to know the things that I will be teaching you. Rising from the window seat beside her, I began prowling the room, noticing details that I had missed earlier and filing them away. Why does he need my help when he already has people like you to help him? Erin asked after a moment, and I glanced at her briefly. She looked curious. If I tell you why he and I both believe that your help is needed, will you promise to consider lending us your assistance? I asked, and resumed examining the walls. I will promise nothing until I know what I may be getting into here. I know myself well enough to know that if I promise to consider something before I know what it is, I will end up agreeing to do it and perhaps live to regret it later, she said. Fair enough, I said, nodding, and told her why we would need her help. I would have thought that he would have other humans that worked for him that could do what you're asking me to do, she said musingly, and I turned to look at her. None of us have ever had human servants or employees for many reasons, one of which is that humans are by nature predisposed to destroy anything that frightens them in any way, and are thus untrustworthy to have around our secrets and homes. 'Tis much safer to keep our own close and keep an eye on the human people around us, I said, shrugging. You're English, she commented, smiling a little, then added, and you have a point about humans in general, but why me if you think so little of human nature? As I explained before, we need a human who can handle themselves in a fight. If Fighting becomes the only option to extract ourselves from the court, and you are the only human hunter that we know of that is still alive in Outer City," I said, and shrugged again.